Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Monday, April the 8th, 2024, day of the eclipse. Over the last few years on Keen On, we've done many shows on mental health. We did one a couple of years ago with the English writer Lucy Fawkes, also a doctor, on the pandemic's impact on mental health. She thought that the impact of COVID was profound. We've done broader shows about the relationship between capitalism and a stigma around mental health with the health historian Roy Richard Grinker. We've done lots of stuff about American mental health, one with Thomas Insel, who is the mental health, or was the mental health czar in California. And we also did a show last year with Phyllis Vine, who wondered whether mental health activism and the mental health issue would become the next major civil rights movement. My guest today is all too familiar, not just with mental health, but also with civil rights in mental health and more broadly in the healthcare industry. Many of you will be familiar with Damon Tweedy. He had a book out a few years ago, Black Man in a White Coat, A Doctor's Reflections on Race and Medicine, which was a huge hit and very well received. And now he has a new book out. It's on mental health, Facing the Unseen, the struggle to center mental health in medicine. Damon Tweedy, MD, is joining us from Raleigh, North Carolina, where he teaches and lives. Damon, is there a link between civil rights and the civil rights movement and mental health? Did that naturally come to you?
I think there's definitely some overlap. You think about, first of all, just thanks for having me, and I'm familiar with those books that you put up there. I'm actually familiar with most of those, actually almost all of them. And yeah, I would say there's absolutely a link. I mean, if you think about it in a couple different ways, you think about how, in some ways, a lot of the things that we talk about. That happened to Black folks back, let's say, the 50s or 60s, and you say, well, how could this thing have happened? How could people have sort of been part of a system where these things take place? Some of these things, I think, are actually things that are occurring in the mental health sphere, last 10, 15 years, even into the present, where people will look back and say, well, gee, how could we have done the things that we've done? I think there's going to be a lot of this. So I think in some ways it's that last piece about being the next front, I can totally see that, because I feel like there's echoes of it from the history. If you go back to I'll give you a concrete example. So in the segregation area, so Duke, where I'm at, certainly was segregated until the 60s. And so there were separate beds for Black people and white people. And so if you're a Black person who needed a bed when the Black bed allotment was full, you're kind of stuck. And there's some of that in this world today. When you think about mental health, there's a separation. Some hospitals have psychiatric beds, some don't. People come to the ER. You can't just go upstairs like you would for a general medical problem, and people might stay in the ER for days, sometimes even weeks, languishing in an ER. And I do think people will look back and wonder what kind of system we had that would allow that to happen. So I think there's definitely some echoes of that.
Damon, the new book, which is out tomorrow, Facing the Unseen, the struggle to center mental health in medicine. The word that really resonates with me is, in this, particularly in the subtitle, is center mental health in medicine. Are you suggesting that it's always been on the edge and that we need to center it? Why has mental health always been on the edge?
Oh, yeah. So there's no question, psychiatrists themselves are on the edge when you think about doctors and this sort of hierarchy of who's the most valued doctor. And so there's that. And then secondly, the patients themselves are no doubt on the margins. And so let's just take one by one. So the doctors, so when you come to medical school, there's this sort of this hierarchy of surgeons. Like when I came to med school thinking I was going to be wanting to become an orthopedic surgeon or cardiologist, these are certainly ones on the higher end of the medical hierarchy in terms of the idea that they deal with things that are, quote, concrete, and they do something in a heroic way and the person's fixed. Right? I mean, that's sort of It's not necessarily always the case, but that's sort of at least the allure. Psychiatry doesn't have the sort of like concreteness in terms of like numbers, lab tests, and this image on an MRI or an X-ray, and we can sort of be more concrete. And so there's this sort of more of a murkiness to it. And that's often relegated psychiatrists to this idea that they're somehow not doing real work. So that's one issue on the margins. From the patient end, there's absolutely the same issue. People with mental health challenges, whether they're depression, anxiety, alcohol use, you name it, may have more challenges. It may take longer to see a person and get to the heart of what needs to happen to help that person. And so in our system, we know where things are just sort of like, fee based and in the volume based sort of system we have, people that with mental health challenges can be seen as more difficult and more complicated, and thus just people that you may just not want to be bothered with. And so I think there's no doubt that there's marginalization occurring both among doctors and patients. It's really bad for everybody, and that's what I'm really getting at in the book.
Damon, something seems to be going on in our culture. It's not necessarily good news, but it seems as if the issue of mental health is becoming increasingly central. It seems to have a generational quality. Younger people are much more comfortable with therapy, but they're also more affected by bad mental health. Now, people describing this generation as the anxious generation.
Right.
Is something changing, or are the rates of mental health or poor mental health, have they always been the same? And is it only today in the 2020s that we're beginning to understand the extent of the problem?
I think it's a fascinating question. I know there's that book out that talks about the anxious generation. I think it's a fascinating question. I think there might be a little bit of both, a couple of things happening. I think there's no doubt that there are people in the past. I can talk about my own family. I'll just give you a couple examples. Like, my grandmother, nowadays she probably would be diagnosed with some sort of anxiety related condition. She paced around, she chain smoked, but she would never have been a person, both in terms of the doctor seeing it that way and her accepting it, of having a mental health issue. So I think there's more of that in the past, but there's, whether you want to use the word stigma or you want to use the word, whatever word you want to apply to it, there's definitely that. And so I think there's, in some ways, we're catching more people now who would not have been caught in the past. So I think that's, so on one hand, I say it's that. But on the other hand, I do think that there are, whether it's social media, I think that's the pieces of that book, whether it's, smartphones and social media, I do think those things do play a role and maybe in the ways that, we have this society that in some ways is connected. It's just like this constant way in which you could just get all this information, and you can kind of constantly compare yourself to other people. And I think someone once said that, comparison is like the thief of happiness or something like that. There's an expression to that effect. There's just sort of constant sense. Like, growing up, I grew up in a working class family. We weren't well off by any stretch of the imagination, but I guess it wasn't this constant awareness of kind of where we sat in relation to others in the way that there would be now. And I think those things just definitely can sort of chip away at a person's sort of, collective sense of security. And so I do think that there's multiple things happening. I think one is that there's more awareness, so that raises numbers. But I think there's also this sense of our society where there's this constant connectivity that just renders this sort of constant sense of comparison, and and seeing everything that's bad in the world can be seen and assessed in such an easy way. I think that does reinforce things. And so whether it's, I don't know if it's just smartphones, I think it's more broadly, our total digital age has definitely caused some distress.
We did a show yesterday, actually, with Mark Hauser, who writes about trauma, particularly in poorer communities outside the United States. One of the things that I asked him about was how you distinguish trauma from general unhappiness. Of course, the ideal of America and of Americans is to be happy. It was even written in the Constitution. Is mental ill health a form of unhappiness? Can one be unhappy and not be ill mentally?
Yes. Yeah, I do think that there's some things here that are like, this is another thing that can be tricky. You're talking about, I think you mentioned about the corporatization, the capitalist, influences in healthcare and medicine. There are definitely people, there's definitely like there are people who clearly have mental health problems, that clearly have troubles, clearly need the services of professionals. There are other people who maybe could benefit from like mental health. The difference between mental health treatment and say like mental health tools that could be helpful for them. Like they may not necessarily need a diagnosis. They may not necessarily need medication and labels that we sort of attach, because our system is sort of works on that. Our health system, you have a label, you have a diagnosis, there's often medication. I don't think that's I think there's probably a bit more of that than needs to be. But I do think a lot of us can benefit from mental health like tools versus sort of like the sort of formal treatment. Does that make sense? That's kind of what I see. So I do see some areas where we can kind of go too far, if to put it another way.
What about trying to quantify this crisis? As I said, you note that it does seem to be at least a crisis in America, facing the unseen. Your new book, The Struggle to Center Mental Health in Medicine. Are we talking 10, 15% of people who perhaps in their life, Damon, might be affected by poor mental health, such poor mental health that they would need to go to a doctor and perhaps take medicine for it?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple layers to that. So if you think pure numbers, it's about 15% or so. You think of like to say take depression, major depression. It's about a 15% sort of like a lifetime prevalence of that. Anxiety disorders are somewhere in that spectrum as well, 15 to 20%. Alcohol use disorders are pretty prevalent. I know alcohol is very embedded in our culture in ways that are, you watch every TV show, at the end of the episode, there's always these people drinking and sort of like, reflecting on things. It's very much embedded in our culture, but, there's a pretty significant component of people who really struggle with alcohol use related problems. 10%, I'm not sure, something in that ballpark range. And then you talk about the more severe mental illness disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, they're, a couple percent. So yes, there's a lot of people that are impacted by this. So as much as we might want to wish that this wasn't so, right, and that these things weren't real, there's significant problems. From the mental health standpoint, lots of people are suffering. Suicide rates have definitely gone up over the last 10 or 15 years, which is obviously a very real thing. People with overdoses, some unintentional, some intentional. All that's gone up a lot, right? And so there's very much a huge problem. There's no doubt about that. So I think from the mental health standpoint, we can say that. I'd like also to talk more about it, how it intersects with the sort of medical world later. But just for now, I would say that there's very clearly a huge problem. We're talking, again, 1 in 4, 1 in 5, 1 in 6 people. So the likelihood that either, if not you, then someone in your sphere, your friend, family is going to be affected is very high.
And of that 1 in 4 or 5 or 6 people in our network, how many of them are actually dealing with it in a medical sense?
It's a great question. So, estimates are that maybe half the people who probably could really benefit from mental health treatment, whether that's medication or whether that's some psychotherapy. We can talk about the nuances of mental health treatment more, but, some sort of like professional level mental health treatment is probably about half of people are getting that care. Gosh. And so why? The obvious question is why? Some of it is our system, right? People can't access the care. It's so burdensome. It's so expensive. The wait lists are so long. So that's one aspect. And then the other side is that some people are just, there's like my grandmother, someone like her would never have been able to receive the idea that.
Tell me a little bit more about your grandmother. Where was she from?
Yeah, so she's just an example. And I have an aunt who, it was a similar story, but a little different. So my grandmother was actually, so if you know that book about Henrietta Lacks.
Yes, I know the author.
Yes, yeah. So my grandmother grew up in that same part of Virginia in the same time in history, just 20 miles away. So we're talking 1920s, 1930s. So, she had a difficult life. This is Jim Crow era. This is the South. Her parents were, they were sharecroppers. We're talking like, nothing, right? And just like almost like slavery by another name in some way. And she was one of like over a dozen children. Her dad died when she was very young, and similar to Henrietta Lacks, she moved to up north, the Great Migration. She went to Washington D.C. She was a housekeeper, a maid, and then she was, again, as a kid, we would visit her, and she was very she was very high strung. She would like be pacing around and talking like she was answering, like she was in a courtroom, and there's sort of like these dramatic sort of flourishes when like having conversations. She's chain smoked. she had a lot of mistrust of the healthcare system, even like in terms of like general medical side of things. So she had she was diagnosed with hypertension, high blood pressure, and she would say, "Well, this doctor is not listening to me," and all this sort of thing. I wasn't in the room; I was like a 12-year-old kid. But so I can't even imagine the idea, that she would receive mental health. Like one of her friends actually suggested that maybe, that she was too stressed out. And she's like, well, you'd be stressed out too if you had my life, right? And then she kind of went into this kind of whole soliloquy about her life. And so she's someone who could have really probably benefited from, how do you manage stress? How do you talk through some of the challenges? But that's not something she could have received based on her experience. And so there's a lot of people out there like that even to this day. So that's one aspect. So the one upside is people like that and how do we reach them? And the other side is our system and how our system fails people. So those are sort of the two things I think are happening where half people aren't getting treatment that they need.
We're speaking with Damon Tweedy, MD, author of new book out tomorrow, Facing the Unseen, important new book about medical health and the need, he believes, at least to center it in the medical community and perhaps more broadly in culture. I want to remind everyone that wonderful guests like Damon Tweedy are brought to us because of our friends at Liberty, a quarterly journal of culture and politics, who do a great job with their own publication, a quarterly. I'm going to run a short feature on it, and then we'll be back with Damon to talk more about mental ill health in America in the 2020s. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
News, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
You can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with Damon Tweedy, MD, the author of Facing the Unseen. New book out tomorrow. Many of you will be familiar with Damon's first book, Black Man in a White Coat, a doctor's reflection on race and medicine. He brought us some bad news there in terms of, I guess, the racism endemic in our medical system. And there's more bad news, although it's not all bad, Facing the Unseen, the struggle to center mental health in medicine. Damon, you teach at Duke. You're all too familiar with the medical community. Is this a book directed at doctors and the medical community, or is it a book directed at the 10, 15, 20% of people who are suffering bad mental health?
It's both. And it's also directed to the people who are like the family members and caregivers and are affected by that 10 or 15%. They might wonder, like, why is this so? Like, why is it so hard to get treatment? Why is this doctor kind of not understanding or getting to the heart of my, issue, right? So they may wonder about, and so what I'm trying to do in this book is sort of give the foundation for like how things have come to be, because we talk about history being important because things didn't just come out of nowhere. Like there's a history that sort of leads us to where we are. And so I really want to explore that. And so the part back to centering, as you mentioned earlier, there's this enormous marginalization. And so I'm speaking. So I want to speak to doctors as well. I want to speak to policymakers, because I think all these things that are happening are because of how we sort of framed mental health as distinct from physical health. And there's this sort of us versus them. Despite the numbers of people that are affected by mental health problems, there's sort of this kind of us versus them kind of, framework. And so thinking back to like medical school, it starts early. And, it starts at the beginning of medical school where psychiatry is, you do your rotation far off from where you do the rest of your rotations. You don't do it at the main hospital in many cases. And it just sets you up to think about mental health and patients with those problems in a way that's different. I can flesh it out more if you'd like, but I just wanted to sort of kind of leave it there. But there's definitely, it starts at the beginning and it just sort of explores and evolves into as you get further along.
Do you think, Damon, that there still remains, and I use this word carefully, a stigma around mental health? There obviously was one in your grandmother's time, but in a generational sense, my understanding, and a lot of it's anecdotal through my children, especially my daughter, is that that stigma has gone away or is going away.
Yeah, I think it's definitely changing. I think it varies depending on, a lot of things though. I think it varies depending on like, I think there's a social class component to that. I think
Mm.
in certain, in a more sort of affluent social class, there may be even less stigma than there once was for sure. Although I mean, there's no doubt that there's still some stigma because one of the challenges with mental health issues is that sometimes people behave in, there's behavior changes that can make people uncomfortable. Like, I'm not sure what to do if this person's yelling or making noise or crying, and it makes us kind of uncomfortable. You kind of want to just, the instinct when you're uncomfortable is the natural instinct for us is to kind of want to, just get away from that situation, right? And then people with alcohol and drug problems, some of the behaviors and patterns can be really uncomfortable and can be upsetting. And so there's definitely stigma that still exists. But I do think that there is a social class component too, where in a cultural component, where certain groups of people may be more open to it than others. That said, I do think generationally there's definitely been efforts by either by celebrities, just by the younger generation more generally, where it's not as bad as it once was. So there's definitely a progress, but there's still more progress that needs to be made.
Yeah, and athletes now are quote
Mhm.
unquote coming out about it. There was a
Mhm.
prominent tennis player last
Yes.
year.
Yep.
What about Damon? And you're the doctor here, so you can explain whether or not this is hardcore medicine. What about the role of the therapist? Everyone these days seems to be a therapist or be at a therapist. Is our current sort of therapeutic culture where there are more and more therapists and many people go to therapy, especially in the middle to upper middle class, is that compounding the problem or is it addressing the problem?
A mix. Sometimes the people who might need it the most, because of the way in which the system is structured, right? A lot of here's a number for you. You mentioned numbers earlier. So you think about how many doctors. Just let's just talk about physicians for now. Then we can go to there's a much broader spectrum in terms of mental health treatment. But let's talk about doctors real quickly. Maybe 90% of doctors in general accept insurance. You think about you think about your internal medicine doctor, pediatrician, et cetera. 90% plus. In psychiatry, maybe half take insurance, right? Um, so if you don't have health insurance, think how hard it is to pay for, 175, 200, depending where you are, 200, $300 an hour sessions weekly. Um, so you really are cutting off a lot of people who just can't get care. So I would say that there's a lot of people who probably need care who just aren't able to access it for that reason. So while there may be plenty of therapists, they might only be seeing a select group of people. And that itself is definitely a problem.
Is there a class component? You've already touched on this, and you've written extensively about it in your other book, Black Man in a White Coat. Is there a class and a race component to this? The people who struggle more in terms of work and poverty, alcoholism, single parent life, are they more prone to mental ill health?
It's tricky. I mean, there's some who will say, on one hand, it seems obvious, right? Yeah, of course they would be necessarily. There's no, I think, but what's been amazing about mental health in the field is we were like, you may have a hard time believing this, but when I was in medical school,
I believe
uh,
everything you say. You're the doctor,
I,
Damon. I believe you.
I'll just tell you. So I'd been told. So when you learn in medical school, as I talked about my first book, every disease you hear about is more common among Black people, whether it's high blood pressure, diabetes, COVID. You always hear that's always worse in Black people. Mental health was ironically different. I was often told, like, it's looking back on it's dumbfounding, where people would say, well, Black people don't really get depression. Black people are somehow kind of immune to it. Um, and you would think, wow, that doesn't really make sense thinking about all the things that Black people have kind of experienced in this country. And so there's actually been this kind of paradoxical kind of thing where people have thought that people of lower social classes and particularly African Americans are less likely to have mental health issues. That's the data does not bear that out, but that was sort of like some of that kind of the things that were told coming along. So to answer your question, is I would say there's two things. I would say it's at least as common among people in the lower social classes, but they're less likely to get treatment. And the other component is that there's also what we might call now social drivers of health that need to be addressed that would also improve mental health that are not happening. So I think there's multiple things can be true at the same time.
You wrote an interesting op-ed in the Washington Post a few years ago on whether or not and when to commit a patient involuntarily to psychiatric care.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts in the book and more broadly about whether people with problematic mental health, whether they can lead quote unquote normal lives. Can they stay at home? Should they be in treatment? Should they be in psychiatric hospitals? What are the things that we as Americans, as friends and family of people perhaps who are suffering from this, what should we be thinking about when it comes to formal psychiatric care versus simply dealing with this within one's normal life?
So there's a great dilemma. I know in California, for instance, I know there's a dilemma about this, right? I haven't followed it too closely, but I know there's this question about how do you manage civil liberties, right? The idea that people should be free of government interference and intrusion, with the idea, the reality that there's a lot of people who are homeless, and mental health and substance use issues are a big component of that. So how do you balance those two things, right? And there's always a sort of constant push and pull. And I think at different times we've gone in on one pole to the other. This probably needs to be some kind of medium pole that we need to find, because right now I think that either extreme is going to have its real downsides. Another thing I'll say about this involuntary commitment thing, which is really struggle to me, is that this is the other issue about psychiatry. So you think about other areas of medicine where someone needs to go from one hospital to another. The ambulance is the way they go. But in mental health, it varies from state to state. Some states, it's the ambulance. Other states, as I talk about in a chapter in my book, there's this whole idea of like police and law enforcement coming into board. They're the ones transporting patients. And that brings in this whole other issue of, when someone has a mental health crisis in the community, should police be the default, which has so often been the case? There's a lot of stories we've heard about that, right? About should law enforcement be that first line person when you call if someone's in distress, or should it be some kind of like mental health crisis mobilization team, or law enforcement police who are much more trained in mental health to really deal with these issues? And I think that's a big issue that we're sort of addressing if we think about the sort of bigger picture of like forced treatment and crisis treatment. And those are things that are really important to think about.
And where do you come down on that?
On which aspect?
On the forced treatment and homelessness. It's a huge debate in San Francisco.
Yes.
We've done shows on that about recognizing, for better or worse, that many homeless people in San Francisco are suffering from bad mental health. And so the question becomes, should they be institutionalized? It's becoming increasingly politicized also in California, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah, one of the things I think one of the things it speaks to is the fact that there aren't enough other services. I think this is one of the things. So you can go about the nuances of. I think there are some cases where people probably need to be having voluntary treatment. I'm really reluctant to do that. That's not something that in the kind of practice I would work in, I'm not involved with that, but I have a lot of misgivings about it. But there are some circumstances where I think it is something that would be necessary. But here's a problem, I think. Well, the way I see it is, so you get this person into a hospital bed. Maybe they stay a week, 2 weeks, whatever may be the case, because the money is sort of making the visits shorter than they used to be. But then what? So then they get out of the hospital, and then there's like this transition to outpatient care, which I think is a huge problem in our system. There's not that in between, which you might call like a partial hospitalization is one term, or some kind of like step down care. It's either like you're in a hospital, right, or you're out in the community, kind of on your own. And I think that's a huge problem. And so many people will fall through the cracks. So I think it speaks to it. So I think we can talk about whether we should be committing people or not. But I think if we don't address this other big in the middle, like what do people do in between hospitals and being home, we're going to run into these problems are going to self-perpetuate. So I think that's a huge thing that doesn't get enough play. There are programs like that available, but again, they're restricted to people who can pay out of pocket. And so again, we're going back to the same system problem. How do we invest in these kinds of programs in a way that can really help people?
Is there a genealogical element to mental ill health? Does it run in families in your view?
I think there's definitely it's not fully characterized, but there's, like, for instance, schizophrenia or bipolar sort of might be considered the most sort of like quote unquote biological, but there's many potential gene candidates. It's not as simple as like, well, sickle cell anemia, this person's a carrier, this person's gonna get it, or cystic fibrosis. It's not like that, of course, but there's definitely some component that is a at the very least, a biological, I would say, predisposition. So it could, twin studies suggest that, the environment is still a huge component, but there's definitely a predisposition that some people have. And under certain circumstances, they're much more likely to express significant mental health distress than others. There's no doubt about that.
There are lots of metaphors you can make about mental ill health, but the one that separates it seems to me, from many other things is suicide and its role in this debate. Often we all face the unseen. We don't recognize it. We don't want to recognize it, or it's hard to see. And then this terrible event occurs. How does this fit in, and the increasing sort of centrality in public debate about suicidal ideas as opposed to actual suicide?
Yeah, so suicide is very much, again, you could go by this idea that there's something that's not real about mental health problems. Well, suicide is obviously the most real of things, very tangible. In my clinic, I've actually seen a lot of family members, right, who've had people, die from suicide. And so, and there's definitely that lasting, impact for people, the parents, the children, spouses, and I've seen a lot of that over the years, and it just sort of sits with you in a very powerful way. I've also talked, of course, with many people who've had suicide attempts, and those sorts of things. I think what's interesting is that, even the language, the terminology, you go back to stigma, the terminology we often use is, commit suicide, right? It's also, it's the same language that you might use to say someone's, committed larceny, or they, felony, or robbery, rape, murder. It's like you commit, like there's this criminal aspect to it. And so like this idea that, like, as I write the book, is suicide more like having a stroke, a medical illness, or is it more like, a sin, right? And so I think there is this sort of, and I think for a long time, we certainly erred more towards the idea that it was a sinful thing.
Or a crime even.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like a crime. Yeah, exactly. Like I said, like, you commit suicide, you commit a crime. And so I think there's something about that we are moving past slowly in terms of, I think language is really important. Commit suicide. I don't like that language because, again, it implies a crime, that you've done something harsh and wrong and horrible. I think we are really, it's such an important issue. We talk about it all the time with our patients, and let me just give you an example, man. Because I think the book opens with this story. It happened where I'm in a doctor calls me, a primary care doctor calls me, and she has a patient who he's a 60-year-old guy, and she tells me that last week his granddaughter walked on him with a gun in his mouth. And she's like, I shouldn't be dealing with this. You need to fix this. And so it's this idea that, she's trained, and I don't want to, I'm not here to bash other doctors, but I'm saying that this is how this is. I want to talk more about this. It's a system. It's this idea that, well, I'm trained to deal with diabetes, high blood pressure, pneumonia, these sort of things, medical issues. I'm not here to deal with this suicide thing. This guy put a gun in his mouth. And I understand that, but the question is like, well, what if someone has both problems? You can have diabetes and you can want to kill yourself, right? And so I think that, and so I was sort of called in this really kind of way how to try to fix this system. And so I think what happens, and I really want to explore this more with you, is how does medical education cause those kinds of scenarios to happen, and what can we do to make that better? I'd love to flesh it out with you a little bit more. But that's just a scenario that's common when you think about suicide. Like this idea that it's something completely different from like kidney failure. But, people have both problems.
Yeah, and let's end on that, Damon. Your book, Black Man in a White Coat, A Doctor's Reflection on Race and Medicine, tells us stuff that perhaps we don't always want to hear. That's why we go to the doctor, and we respect what you're saying. Mm-hmm. Perhaps you might pick out one or two messages in particular that you want to use this book to send both internally to the medical community, which you're all too familiar with, right, and then more broadly to the culture about mental ill health. What are you trying to say, and what's the message that you want to get through?
Yeah, so I really want to get the message too that we have to educate. So doctors are educated to think of it traditionally as mental health as something separate, marginalized, distinct. And so when you encounter patients who have medical issues and mental health issues, there's often an aversion to those patients. And our training makes it seem like people with mental health problems don't ever get better, and they're always going to be complicated and sick and kind of helpless in a sort of way. So if we are exposed to mental health, patients with mental health problems on a continuum, we will see that this is really this continuum. So like to just give you an example, somebody with a mental health illness, we see someone with alcohol use, we see them in the hospital when they're intoxicated, when they're withdrawing, they're in their worst state. But if we also are able to work in settings in medical school where we see people who are in recovery from alcohol for 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, we get a sense that there's a spectrum. And so when we see that person who's in a bad place, we know that there's the other side, there are other people who are doing much better. And it helps us think about that person in crisis in a different way. And I think that is so medical system has traditionally been, you only seeing people in sick, it's like a sick care system at their worst, at their most vulnerable. But so we're versus seeing people on a continuum, that people, this may be one part of their life, but this is there's hope and that they can get better. And I don't think we see enough that the way that the medical education system is structured. So there are reforms that I talk about in the book that are making that more accessible to students at a younger age. And they make me very hopeful about how we can improve these things for patients moving forward.
And what about more broadly within the culture? Does it need to be normalized or medicalized in the way we perceive mental ill health?
Well, I wouldn't say medicalized so per se. I think we just need to think about it as we need to be thinking about these things. You can't separate them the way we want to. We say, well, there's your mental health and there's physical health, but we all know that there's we have you're nervous, your stomach can get grumpy. There's so many, even something small like that. We know that the mind and body are intertwined. And I think as a society, we need to be open to, because we'll see patients who will say, well, I have this physical problem, and you can't get through to them that there's a connection between the two, right? So I think that our society sort of framed it that way. And the more that, whether it's policymakers, whether it's insurance companies, or whether it's our own family members, we might see someone, like the problem with mental health is we might have a family member, we think, oh, this person is just being difficult or lazy or they don't want to do something. We wouldn't say that about someone in the same way with a medical, like what we consider a medical illness. And so the more we can embrace that there's this mind and body are always intertwined, I think the better off that we're all going to be. And I think that's where I really want to get. So that's true for patients, it's true for family members, and it's true for the doctors who care for them.
And finally, Damon, for people in the audience who might be suffering and from at least sense that there's something wrong with them, and I use that carefully, maybe it's the wrong way of putting it, what should they do? Should they go to their doctor? Should they read your book?
So I'd love for them to read my book, but I don't want my book is not a substitute for the idea. There's this whole kind of, my book's not a substitute for like you talking with someone. There's all different ways that people to sort of enter entrees into care, whether that's through, a pastor, if that's your thing, or a therapist. Your primary care doctor often is your first line person. And so I've been talking more and more about educating primary care doctors about these issues. And so that's a big part of what I do in my own practice, is work with those doctors to do better, because that's often the first line. We're going to see the first line thing, but definitely reach out to someone. Sometimes it may be that, a family member has to come with you to that visit to really explain, because a lot of times, if someone's really in a suffering state, they can't fully kind of explain and express what's happening to them. And often it's helpful to have a friend or a family member come with you. And that could really help, the medical person get a much better feel for what's going on. But definitely don't suffer in silence. As hard as it is to get treatment, treatment can indeed be life-saving for many people.